The shadow of death had followed Catherine Lawson for 300 miles across the unforgiving western frontier. But it wasn't until her wagon wheel struck a hidden boulder that she truly believed her time had come. The impact sent her tumbling from her perch, her body airborne for one terrifying moment before she plunged into the rushing waters of Cottonwood Creek. The frigid water stole the breath from her lungs as the current immediately seized her, dragging her downstream over slick stones and branches. Catherine flailed desperately, her sodden skirts weighing her down like anchors. She had fled Chicago to escape death, not to find it in some nameless creek in Wyoming territory. "You're not drowning on my watch." The deep voice cut through the roar of the water just as a strong hand grabbed her collar, yanking her upward with enough force to tear the fabric. Catherine gasped as her head broke the surface, water streaming from her hair and clothes as she was half dragged, half carried toward the bank. Through water-blurred eyes, she made out the silhouette of a man tall and broad-shouldered against the setting sun. A cowboy, judging by the Stetson hat and the worn leather vest she could now discern as her vision cleared. "Easy now," he said, his voice gentler as he set her down on the grassy bank. "You're safe, madam." Catherine coughed violently, expelling creek water from her lungs as she struggled to catch her breath. When she finally looked up at her rescuer, she found herself staring into the most startling blue eyes she'd ever seen, set in a sun-weathered face beneath a shock of sandy brown hair. "Thank you," she managed between coughs. "I thought I was going to meet your maker." The cowboy's mouth curved into a slight smile as he crouched beside her. "Not today, though I reckon that wagon of yours has seen better days." Catherine turned to look upstream where her wagon tilted precariously at the creek's edge, one wheel completely shattered, the contents of her life scattered along the bank and floating downstream. "Everything I own," she whispered, the reality of her situation crashing down upon her with more force than the creek's current. The cowboy stood, water dripping from his denim pants and leather boots as he extended a hand to her. "Name's Ethan Vance. I've got a cabin about a mile from here. Let's get you dried off before you catch your death." Catherine hesitated only briefly before taking his hand. In the Wyoming Territory of 1876, a woman alone had few options when disaster struck. And despite the rough exterior, there was something in Ethan Vance's eyes that made her trust him, perhaps the fact that he'd just plunged into a creek to save a stranger's life. "Catherine Lawson," she replied, allowing him to help her to her feet. "I'm in your debt, Mr. Vance." Ethan whistled sharply, and a magnificent chestnut mare trotted from the trees. "No debt between folks out here, Miss Lawson. The wilderness doesn't discriminate sooner or later. We all need saving." As he helped her onto his horse, Catherine couldn't help but wonder if her salvation had come in more ways than one. She had left Chicago with death on her heels and a heart encased in ice. Perhaps the waters of Cottonwood Creek had washed away more than just the dust of her journey. Ethan's cabin stood in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees, a humble but solid structure with a thin plume of smoke rising from the stone chimney. Catherine sat stiffly on the horse behind him, acutely aware of her hands gripping his waist for balance. Despite her sodden clothes, she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "It's not much," Ethan said as he helped her dismount, "but it's dry and warm." Inside, the cabin was surprisingly tidy for a man living alone on the frontier. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a small table and 2 chairs occupied another, and a narrow bed stood against the far wall. Bundles of herbs hung from the ceiling beams, filling the space with a pleasant, earthy scent. "You'll need dry clothes," Ethan said, moving to a wooden trunk. He pulled out a flannel shirt and denims that would clearly engulf her smaller frame. "They're clean, at least. I'll step outside while you change." Once alone, Catherine peeled off her wet dress and undergarments with trembling fingers. The events of the day of the past month threatened to overwhelm her. She had been running for so long, first from Chicago after her father's murder, then from the men who had followed her west. Now her wagon was destroyed, her supplies lost, and she was at the mercy of a stranger in the wilderness. Yet as she pulled on Ethan's clothes, rolling up the sleeves and pant legs, she felt a curious sense of calm. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. A knock at the door preceded Ethan's voice. "Decent." "Yes," Catherine replied, running her fingers through her damp auburn hair in a futile attempt to tame it. Ethan entered carrying her satchel and a small trunk. "Managed to salvage these from your wagon. The current was getting stronger, couldn't get more without risking another swim." "You've done more than enough," Catherine said, eyeing the rescued items with relief. The satchel contained her father's journal and the papers that might keep her alive. The trunk held some clothes and personal items. Ethan busied himself at the fireplace, adding logs to the low-burning fire until flames leaped high, filling the cabin with welcome heat. "Hungry?" As if in response, Catherine's stomach growled audibly. She hadn't eaten since morning, having pushed on toward the nearest town rather than stopping for a midday meal. Ethan smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his rugged features. "I'll take that as a yes. Got some rabbit stew left from yesterday. Not fancy, but it'll fill your belly." As he heated the stew in a cast iron pot over the fire, Catherine seated herself at the table, trying to gather her thoughts. "You live out here alone, Mr. Vance." "Ethan," he corrected, stirring the pot. "And yes, just me and Sadie, that's my horse. Been that way 3 years now." "You're far from town," Catherine observed. "That's the point," Ethan replied, his tone light but with an undercurrent Catherine recognized all too well. He was a man running from something, just as she was. They ate in companionable silence, the stew surprisingly flavorful with wild herbs and tender meat. As the warmth of the food and fire seeped into her bones, Catherine found herself fighting exhaustion. "You take the bed," Ethan said, noticing her drooping eyelids. "I'll make do on the floor." "I couldn't possibly." "You could and you will," he interrupted gently. "Nearly drowning takes it out of a person. You need proper rest." Too tired to argue further, Catherine gratefully sank onto the narrow bed while Ethan spread a blanket before the fireplace. She watched through heavy-lidded eyes as he checked the door latch and placed his revolver within easy reach before settling down. "Mr. Vance, Ethan," she murmured, sleep already claiming her. "Thank you for saving my life." "Get some rest, Miss Lawson," came his quiet reply. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." As Catherine drifted into sleep, she realized it was the first time in weeks she felt safe enough to truly rest. The irony wasn't lost on her that she should find safety with a stranger in the wilderness, when civilization had proven so dangerous. Morning arrived with golden light filtering through the cabin's single window. Catherine woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She sat up quickly, finding herself alone in the cabin. Her clothes, now dry, lay folded at the foot of the bed. Ethan must have brought them in from where they'd been spread to dry by the fire. Catherine changed quickly, grateful to be back in her own garments, though she noted with some embarrassment that her proper Chicago attire was woefully impractical for frontier life. Outside, she found Ethan chopping wood with powerful, measured strokes. He had removed his shirt in the morning heat, and Catherine found herself transfixed by the play of muscles beneath his sun-bronzed skin. Scars crisscrossed his back, old wounds with stories she suddenly wanted to know. Sensing her presence, Ethan turned, immediately reaching for his shirt and pulling it on. "Morning," he said, a hint of color rising beneath his tan cheeks. "Sleep well. Better than I have in weeks," Catherine admitted. "I'm sorry to have displaced you from your bed." Ethan waved away her concern, driving his axe into the chopping block. "Thought we might ride into town today. Cottonwood's about 10 miles south. You can arrange for transport to wherever you were headed." Catherine's heart sank at his words, though she couldn't say why. Perhaps it was the prospect of returning to her solitary journey, or perhaps it was the thought of leaving this quiet sanctuary and the man who had created it. "That would be best," she agreed nonetheless. "I was headed to Laramie. My uncle lives there." Ethan nodded, but a shadow passed across his face. "Laramie's a 3-day ride at least, dangerous country between here and there." "I don't have much choice," Catherine said, more sharply than she'd intended. "I can't stay here." "No," Ethan agreed, his expression unreadable. "I suppose you can't." Over a breakfast of cornbread and coffee, Catherine found herself studying her rescuer. In the clear morning light, she estimated him to be in his early 30s, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of squinting into the sun, and perhaps more laughter than his current solitary existence suggested. "You're not from these parts originally," Ethan observed suddenly. "Your speech marks you as Eastern, educated." Catherine tensed, wary of revealing too much. "Chicago," she admitted finally. "My father was a professor at the university." He died." The words hung between them, stark and insufficient. Ethan nodded, not pressing for details. "My condolences." "And you?" Catherine asked, eager to shift attention away from herself. "You don't strike me as a man born to solitude." A wry smile touched Ethan's lips. "Virginia originally. After the war, there wasn't much left for me there." The war. The simple phrase explained much about the scars on his back, the shadows that occasionally darkened his eyes, his choice to live apart from others. Like so many men, Ethan Vance had survived the war between the states only to find that peace offered its own battles. "We should head out while the morning's still cool," Ethan said, rising from the table. "I'll saddle Sadie." As Catherine gathered her few salvaged possessions, she found herself reluctant to leave the cabin that had sheltered her for only a single night. There was something about this place and its owner that called to her, offering a peace she hadn't known she was seeking. The ride to Cottonwood was largely silent, with Catherine seated behind Ethan, her arms encircling his waist. The terrain was beautiful but rugged, with sweeping vistas of mountains and valleys that stole her breath. So different from the crowded streets of Chicago, yet Catherine found herself thinking that she could grow accustomed to such wild beauty. Cottonwood proved to be little more than a cluster of wooden buildings straddling the stage-coach route, a general store, a saloon, a small church, and a handful of homes. Ethan guided Sadie toward a 2-story building with Henderson's Mercantile and Post painted across its weathered facade. "Mr. Henderson will know when the next stage to Laramie is due," Ethan explained as he helped Catherine dismount. "And you can purchase whatever supplies you need to replace what was lost." Inside the store, they found a pot-bellied man with mutton chop whiskers arranging tins of beans on a shelf. He turned at their entrance, his bushy eyebrows rising in surprise. "Ethan Vance, as I live and breathe. Twice in 1 month the mountains must be getting crowded for you to visit civilization so often." "Hello, George," Ethan replied with a small smile. "This is Miss Catherine Lawson. She had some trouble on the trail, lost her wagon in Cottonwood Creek. She needs passage to Laramie." George Henderson's gaze shifted to Catherine, his expression immediately sympathetic. "Terrible luck, Miss Lawson. the creeks running high with the spring melt. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. I'm afraid the stage won't be through for another 5 days. Had a breakdown about 30 miles east of here. Catherine's heart sank. 5 days stranded in this tiny settlement was the last thing she needed. Her pursuers could be anywhere, and staying in one place made her an easy target. Is there anyone heading toward Laramie who might offer me transport? She asked, struggling to keep the desperation from her voice. George shook his head. Not that I know of. Most folks around here stay close to home this time of year, trails too muddy for comfortable travel. Catherine felt Ethan's eyes on her, studying her reaction. Before she could formulate a response, the mercantile's door swung open and 3 men entered. Catherine instinctively stepped back, her body tensing then relaxed when she saw they were simply local farmers coming to purchase supplies. But her reaction hadn't gone unnoticed by Ethan. His blue eyes narrowed slightly as he observed her, a question forming in them that Catherine desperately hoped he wouldn't ask aloud. Miss Lawson will need a room at Mrs. Wilkins's boarding house, Ethan said to George, still watching Catherine, and some new clothes and supplies. I can't afford, Catherine began, embarrassed to admit that most of her money had been in her wagon, likely washed downstream or soaked beyond recognition. Consider it a loan, Ethan interrupted quietly. You can repay me when you reach your uncle in Laramie. Pride warred with necessity in Catherine's heart, but necessity won. She had no choice but to accept his help. Thank you. That's very kind. While George tallied the cost of the items Catherine would need, Ethan stepped closer to her, speaking in a low voice that wouldn't carry to the others in the store. You're running from something, he said. It wasn't a question. Catherine met his gaze steadily. Aren't we all? A flicker of surprise crossed Ethan's features, followed by something like respect. Fair enough, he conceded. But whatever or whoever it is, 5 days in a town this small makes you vulnerable. I'm aware, Catherine replied, her throat tight with fear she refused to show. Ethan hesitated, clearly wrestling with some internal debate. Finally, he said, my cabin's safer, remote. No one would look for you there. The offer hung between them, unexpected and fraught with implications. Catherine barely knew this man, yet he was offering her shelter protection. In Chicago society, such an arrangement would be scandalous beyond measure. But Chicago was hundreds of miles away, and the rules of survival in the Wyoming territory were different. Why would you do that? Catherine asked, searching his face for hidden motives. Ethan's expression remained grave. Because I know what it's like to be hunted. Before Catherine could respond, George returned with a list of supplies and their costs. Ethan paid without hesitation, a substantial sum that made Catherine's debt to him grow uncomfortably large. As they left the mercantile, Ethan said, I need to visit the telegraph office. Wait here. Catherine watched him cross the muddy street, his tall figure commanding respect even in this frontier setting where most men carried themselves with the independence born of harsh living. She wondered what message he needed to send, and to whom this man who lived alone in the wilderness, apparently by choice. When he returned, his expression was grim. Decision time, Miss Lawson. We can get you a room at the boarding house, or you can return with me to the cabin until the stage arrives. Catherine knew the sensible choice was to remain in town, where there were other people and the trappings of civilization, however minimal. But her instincts, the same instincts that had kept her alive since fleeing Chicago, told her that Ethan Vance represented her best chance of survival. Your cabin, she said firmly, if the offer still stands. Relief flickered briefly across Ethan's face. It does. He helped her mount Sadie, then swung up behind her, reversing their earlier riding arrangement. We'll collect your supplies and head back immediately. As they rode out of Cottonwood, Catherine fighting the awkwardness of sitting astride a horse for the first time in her life, Ethan maintained a vigilant silence, his body tense behind her. Only when the settlement had disappeared behind them did he speak. "I sent a telegram to a friend in Cheyenne," he said. "Asked him to let me know if anyone's been asking about a woman matching your description." Catherine stiffened. "You had no right." "I had every right," Ethan countered, his voice firm but not unkind. "You're staying in my home. I need to know what kind of trouble might come calling." The logic was undeniable, yet Catherine felt exposed, her carefully guarded secrets threatened. "I'm not a criminal," she said finally. "Never thought you were," Ethan replied. "But that doesn't mean you're not in danger." They rode in silence for several miles, the rhythm of Sadie's hooves a steady counterpoint to Catherine's tumultuous thoughts. Finally, she spoke, the words emerging reluctantly. "My father was murdered 6 weeks ago. The men who killed him believe he gave something to me before he died, something valuable. They're right." She took a deep breath. "I've been running ever since." Ethan didn't respond immediately, processing her admission. "These men, they followed you west." "Yes. I've seen them in 3 different towns since crossing the Mississippi. I thought I'd lost them after Denver, but you're not sure," Ethan finished for her. His arms tightened slightly around her waist as he reached forward to guide Sadie around a fallen tree. "What did your father give you that's worth killing for?" Catherine hesitated. Trust came hard after weeks of looking over her shoulder. But Ethan had already risked himself for her once, pulling her from the creek without hesitation. And now he was offering her sanctuary despite the danger it might bring to his door. "A journal," she said finally. "And a map. My father was a geologist before becoming a professor. He discovered a silver deposit in the mountains near Laramie, a significant one, according to his notes. And these men found out somehow," Ethan surmised. "My father trusted the wrong person, a former colleague who brought these men to our home demanding the map." Catherine's voice caught as memories of that terrible night flooded back. "When father refused, they shot him. I was upstairs. They didn't know I was home." Ethan was silent for so long that Catherine wondered if he regretted his offer of shelter. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with controlled anger. "You'll be safe at my cabin, Catherine. I promise you that." The use of her given name, the first time he had called her anything. But Miss Lawson sent an unexpected warmth through her, despite the grim circumstances. There was something in the way he said it, a softness beneath the steel, that made her believe him. They reached the cabin as afternoon shadows lengthened toward evening. Ethan immediately set about securing the perimeter, checking sight lines and reinforcing the door's latch, while Catherine organized the supplies they had purchased. "I was a scout during the war," Ethan explained as he moved a small table to block direct view through the cabin's single window. "Learned to make a position defensible with limited resources." Catherine watched him work, noting the efficiency of his movements, the careful consideration he gave to each adjustment of the cabin's interior. "You were Union," she said. Not a question, but a statement based on his earlier mention of Virginia, a Confederate state being a place he couldn't return to after the war. Ethan paused, glancing at her with surprise. "Yes. My family owned no slaves and believed in the Union, unlike most of our neighbors, made for an uncomfortable situation when war broke out." "Is that why you came west? Because you couldn't go home?" A shadow crossed Ethan's face. "Partly. There's not much waiting for Union soldiers in Virginia even now, but mostly." He trailed off, returning to his work. "Mostly," Catherine prompted gently. Ethan's hand stilled on the window frame. "War changes a man," he said finally. "Makes him see things, do things that don't fit easily into ordinary life afterward." Out here, with just the mountains and sky, a man can find a kind of peace. Catherine understood then why he had chosen solitude, and why her presence disrupted more than just his physical space. She was bringing the complications of human connection back into a life carefully arranged to avoid them. "I'm sorry to intrude on your peace," she said softly. Ethan turned to her, his expression softening. "Don't be. Sometimes isolation becomes its own kind of prison. Maybe I needed." He stopped, seeming embarrassed by whatever he had been about to say. Catherine busied herself with preparing a meal from their supplies, giving Ethan space to retreat from the moment of vulnerability. As she worked, she found herself humming softly a habit her father had always teased her about, claiming she could turn any kitchen into an opera house. "That's pretty," Ethan commented, returning from checking the perimeter of the cabin. "What is it?" Catherine felt her cheeks warm. "Just a folk song my mother used to sing. She was Irish, came to America as a girl." "My mother was fond of singing too," Ethan said, taking a seat at the table. "She said music keeps the soul from growing stale." "A wise woman," Catherine replied, serving a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and biscuits, frontier fare that bore little resemblance to the sophisticated meals she had grown up with in Chicago, but satisfying nonetheless. As they ate, Ethan gradually drew out more of Catherine's story: her childhood in Chicago, her father's work at the university, her own education, which had been more extensive than most women received. In turn, he shared fragments of his past, growing up on a small farm in the Shenandoah Valley, his service as a scout for the Union Army, his journey west after the war. "I tried mining for a while near Central City," he said, "but found I preferred hunting and trapping. The solitude suited me better than the mining camps." "And now," Catherine asked, "what do you do out here besides rescue drowning women from creeks?" Ethan's mouth quirked in a half-smile that transformed his rugged features. "Hunt, trap, do some guiding for the occasional survey team or hunting party. It's enough to keep me in coffee and ammunition." "You never thought of returning to civilization, finding a wife, starting a family?" The question slipped out before Catherine could consider its impropriety. In Chicago, such a personal inquiry to a man she barely knew would have been scandalous. Ethan's expression grew distant. "Once, perhaps, but that was a different man in a different time." He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "What about you? No husband waiting back in Chicago?" "No," Catherine said, matching his honesty with her own. "I was engaged briefly, but we weren't well suited. My father's death ended any obligation before it could become permanent." "A fortunate escape, then," Ethan observed. "Yes," Catherine agreed, surprised by how true it felt. Harold Ashton had been wealthy, socially prominent, and utterly indifferent to Catherine's mind or spirit. The engagement had been more her father's wish than her own, a fact that had filled her with guilt since his death. As night fell, they settled into an unexpectedly comfortable routine, as if they had shared this space for months rather than a single day. Ethan took the first watch, insisting that Catherine get some rest while he kept vigil. "I'll wake you in 4 hours," he promised, checking the load in his Remington revolver before settling into a chair positioned to view both the door and window. Catherine slipped into his bed, surrounded by the scent of him, pine and leather, and something uniquely masculine that she found oddly comforting. As she drifted towards sleep, she reflected on the strange turns her journey had taken, leading her to this cabin, and this man who seemed determined to protect her from dangers he barely understood. For the first time since her father's murder, Catherine felt the faint stirrings of hope that she might survive the nightmare her life had become. And perhaps more unsettling, She felt the first fluttering of emotion she had never expected to feel again: attraction, interest, the mysterious pull toward another person that went beyond mere gratitude for his help. Such feelings were dangerous, Catherine reminded herself as sleep claimed her. She would be gone in 5 days, continuing to Laramie and the uncle who might help her claim her father's discovery legally before the men pursuing her could steal it. Ethan Vance was a temporary haven, nothing more. Yet as she succumbed to exhaustion, Catherine couldn't help but wonder if fate had more in store for them than a brief intersection of their solitary paths. True to his word, Ethan woke her 4 hours later, his touch on her shoulder gentle but firm. "Your watch," he murmured, offering her the revolver. "You know how to use this." Catherine took the weapon, its weight familiar in her hand. "My father taught me. He believed women should be able to defend themselves." Ethan's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded in approval. "Smart man. Watch the tree line east of the cabin, best approach for anyone trying to stay hidden. If you see anything, wake me immediately. Don't try to handle it alone." As Ethan settled onto his blanket before the dying fire, Catherine took up position in the chair, the revolver resting in her lap. Through the window, she could see the star-filled sky above the dark outline of pines, the night peaceful and still. It seemed impossible that danger could find her in this remote sanctuary, yet experience had taught her that safety was always an illusion. The hours of her watch passed quietly, marked only by the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of night creatures in the underbrush. Catherine found herself studying Ethan's sleeping form, the firelight casting shadows across his features, softening the hard lines etched by sun and hardship. In repose, he looked younger, the weight of his past temporarily lifted. What had he seen during the war that drove him to seek solitude in the wilderness? What losses had shaped him into the man who would dive into a rushing creek to save a stranger without hesitation? When dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Catherine rose quietly to stoke the fire and prepare coffee. Ethan woke instantly at her movement, years of vigilance evident in the way his hand reached automatically for a weapon before his eyes had fully opened. "All quiet," Catherine said softly. "No visitors, hostile or otherwise." Ethan relaxed, running a hand through his tousled hair. "Good. Though I don't expect trouble this soon. If someone's tracking you, they'd need to pick up your trail from the creek first." They settled into a routine over the next 2 days, sharing watches, hunting and gathering food, maintaining the cabin. Catherine discovered that Ethan was knowledgeable about local plants, pointing out which were edible or medicinal as they walked the area around the cabin. "My grandmother was half Cherokee," he explained as he showed her how to identify wild onions. "She taught me to live off the land before I could read." "My education was somewhat different," Catherine admitted, carefully digging up the onions as he had shown her. "Literature, mathematics, music, French, all designed to make me an ornament to society." Ethan glanced at her, amusement dancing in his blue eyes. "And here you are instead, grubbing in the dirt with a Virginia rebel." "Former rebel," Catherine corrected with a smile. "And I find I prefer this education to dancing the quadrille with Chicago's eligible bachelors." On the 3rd day, a spring storm moved in, bringing driving rain that confined them to the cabin. The close quarters heightened Catherine's awareness of Ethan's presence, the breadth of his shoulders as he added wood to the fire, the graceful strength in his hands as he cleaned his rifle, the timbre of his voice as he told her stories of the mountains to pass the time. "There's a valley about 10 miles north of here," he said as they sat before the fire, the rain drumming on the cabin's roof. "In summer, it's filled with wildflowers, blue columbine and Indian paintbrush. First time I saw it, I thought I'd stumbled into some kind of paradise." You should have been a poet, not a trapper, Catherine teased gently. Ethan laughed, the sound rich and unexpected. Don't tell anyone. Bad for my reputation. Your secret is safe with me, Catherine promised, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, their shoulders nearly touching as they leaned toward the fire's warmth. Ethan's laughter faded as their eyes met, something electric passing between them. For a long moment, neither moved, the only sounds the crackling fire and the steady patter of rain. Then Ethan cleared his throat, shifting away slightly. I should check the roof. Sometimes these storms find leaks. Catherine watched him move about the cabin, testing for drips with practiced efficiency. The moment had passed, but its impact lingered, leaving her pulse racing and her thoughts in disarray. That night, as they prepared for sleep, Ethan broke their established pattern. Take the bed, he said. I'll keep watch tonight. The whole night, Catherine asked, concerned. You need rest too. I've gone longer without sleep, Ethan replied, his expression unreadable. I'm restless anyway. The storm makes me uneasy. Catherine didn't press further, sensing that his decision had less to do with the weather and more to do with the tension growing between them. As she settled into bed, she heard him checking his weapons with methodical precision, a soldier's ritual before battle. She woke sometime in the deepest part of night to find Ethan still vigilant, his silhouette stark against the faint glow of the banked fire. He stood at the window, staring out into the darkness, his posture alert despite the late hour. Ethan, she called softly. He turned, his face half hidden in shadow. Go back to sleep, Catherine. Everything's fine. But there was something in his voice that belied his words, a tightness, a strain. Catherine rose from the bed, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the night's chill. What is it? She asked, moving to stand beside him at the window. Ethan hesitated, then sighed. Probably nothing. Thought I saw a light out toward the creek. Could have been a reflection of the moon on water. Catherine peered into the darkness, seeing nothing but the faint outline of trees against the night sky. The rain had stopped, leaving a preternatural stillness in its wake. Or it could have been someone, she said quietly. Yes. Ethan's hand moved unconsciously to the revolver at his hip. We'll know soon enough. If someone's out there, they'll make their move by dawn. Catherine's heart began to pound, fear that had temporarily receded now returning full force. I've brought danger to your door. Ethan turned to her, his face serious in the dim light. You didn't bring it, Catherine. It was following you already. I chose to stand between you and it. His hand rose, hesitating before gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. And I'd make the same choice again. The simple touch sent warmth cascading through Catherine's body. Without thinking, she leaned into his hand, her eyes closing briefly at the tenderness of the gesture. Ethan drew in a sharp breath, his hand stilling against her cheek. When her eyes opened, his face was inches from hers, his expression a complex mixture of desire and restraint. Catherine, he whispered, her name a question and a warning both. In answer, Catherine closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his with a boldness that surprised even her. For an instant, Ethan remained frozen as if in shock. Then with a sound low in his throat, he pulled her against him, returning her kiss with an intensity that left her breathless. His arms encircled her, strong and protective, as the kiss deepened. Catherine felt herself melting into him, all thought of danger temporarily banished by the overwhelming sensation of being held, desired, cherished. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Ethan rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed as if gathering his control. That was. He began, then stopped, seeming at a loss for words. Unexpected, Catherine supplied, her own voice unsteady. A rueful smile touched his lips as he opened his eyes to meet her gaze. "I was going to say inevitable. From the moment I pulled you from that creek, I've been falling for you, Catherine Lawson." The confession, so plainly stated, brought tears to Catherine's eyes. In the midst of danger and uncertainty, this man had given her something precious: honesty, caring, a connection she had never expected to find in the wilderness. "I've never felt this way," she admitted. Not even with the crack of a branch outside the cabin silenced her instantly. Ethan's body tensed, all softness vanishing as he transformed back into the vigilant protector. In one fluid motion, he moved Catherine behind him and drew his revolver. "Someone's out there," he whispered. "Get your father's papers and be ready to move if I give the word." Catherine hurried to retrieve the oilskin packet containing her father's journal and map from her satchel, her hands trembling but determined. When she returned to Ethan's side, he was peering cautiously around the edge of the window. "Can you see anything?" she whispered. "Movement near the tree line," he replied softly. "At least 2 men, maybe 3. Fear gripped Catherine's heart. "They found me." "They haven't got you yet," Ethan replied grimly, "and they won't while I'm breathing." The determination in his voice steadied her, pushing back the panic that threatened to overwhelm her senses. This man, who had known her less than a week, was prepared to risk his life to protect her. The realization was both humbling and terrifying. "There's a trapdoor under the rug," Ethan said, still watching the window. "Root cellar beneath. If shooting starts, you get down there and stay hidden." "I won't leave you to face them alone," Catherine protested. Ethan turned to her, his expression fierce. "This isn't negotiable, Catherine. I can't protect you if I'm worried about you catching a stray bullet." Before she could argue further, a voice called from outside the cabin. "Hello, the house. Anyone home?" Ethan and Catherine exchanged glances, tension vibrating between them. "Stay back," Ethan murmured. Then louder. "Who's asking?" "Name's Collins. Me and my partners are looking for a young lady might have passed this way. Her family's worried sick about her." Catherine shook her head violently, mouthing lies to Ethan, who nodded his understanding. "Haven't seen any ladies out this way," Ethan called back. "Just me and my dog in here." A pause, then. "Mind if we come in and warm ourselves? Been tracking through the rain all night." "Mind very much," Ethan replied, his voice hardening. "Not in the habit of entertaining strangers before dawn." Another pause, longer this time. Then the sound of hushed conversation carried faintly through the walls. "They're planning something," Catherine whispered, her body tense with dread. Ethan nodded grimly. "Get ready to move to the cellar." The next moment, the window exploded inward as a shot rang out, sending glass shards flying across the cabin floor. Ethan reacted instantly, shoving Catherine toward the trapdoor while returning fire through the shattered window. "Go!" he shouted, ducking as another bullet splintered the wooden frame beside his head. Catherine scrambled to pull back the rug, revealing the wooden trapdoor beneath. She yanked it open, the heavy wood protesting with a groan of rusted hinges. As she prepared to descend, a crash from the front of the cabin made her look up in horror. The door burst inward, torn from its hinges by the combined weight of 2 men. Ethan pivoted, firing at the intruders, catching one in the shoulder. The man cried out, staggering backward, but his companion pressed forward, a revolver aimed at Ethan. Without thinking, Catherine raised her own gun and fired. The shot went wide but distracted the attacker enough for Ethan to tackle him, driving him to the floor with bone-jarring force. The 2 men grappled for control of the weapon, muscles straining as they rolled across the rough planks. A third man appeared in the doorway, his attention fixing instantly on Catherine. "There you are, Miss Lawson," he said, his voice cultured but cold. We've had quite the chase, haven't we? Catherine recognized him immediately, Professor James Whitfield, her father's former colleague and betrayer. The man who had brought murderers to their home and watched as they shot her father. "You killed him," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "You watched them murder my father." Whitfield shrugged as if the accusation was of no consequence. He should have shared his discovery. "Academics aren't meant to be wealthy, Catherine. Your father forgot that. So you decided to steal what was his." Catherine's finger tightened on the trigger of her revolver, which was now pointed directly at Whitfield's chest. The professor's eyes narrowed. "I wouldn't advise that, my dear. You may get me, but my associates would certainly kill your protector." He gestured toward where Ethan was still struggling with the other man, their fight having reached a temporary stalemate. Catherine's resolve wavered, her gaze flickering between Whitfield and Ethan. In that moment of distraction, Whitfield lunged forward, grabbing her wrist and twisting until the gun clattered to the floor. "Now," he said, breathing heavily as he maintained his grip on her arm, "where is your father's journal?" A gunshot rang out, startling both of them. Catherine turned to see Ethan rising from the floor, his opponent lying motionless beside him. Blood stained Ethan's shirt near his shoulder, but the revolver in his hand was steady as he aimed it at Whitfield. "Let her go," Ethan commanded, his voice deadly quiet. Whitfield's grip tightened painfully on Catherine's arm as he pulled her in front of him like a shield. "Drop your weapon, sir, or I'll snap her arm like kindling." Catherine met Ethan's eyes, silently pleading with him not to surrender his advantage. But she saw the moment his resolve crumbled, his concern for her overriding tactical considerations. Slowly, he placed his revolver on the floor. "Kick it away," Whitfield ordered. Ethan complied, sending the weapon skidding across the cabin floor. "Now let her go." "Whatever quarrel you have is with her, not me," Whitfield laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "On the contrary, you've made yourself quite thoroughly a part of this affair." He glanced around the cabin. "Now, Miss Lawson, where are your father's papers? The journal and the map?" Catherine remained silent, her mind racing. The packet was still tucked inside her bodice, where she had placed it after retrieving it from her satchel. If she revealed it, Whitfield would have no reason to keep either of them alive. "Search the place," Whitfield called to the man Ethan had shot in the shoulder, who had recovered enough to stagger back into the cabin. "It must be here somewhere." As the injured man began rifling through Catherine's belongings, Ethan caught her eye, a silent message passing between them. With the slightest nod, he indicated the fallen man's revolver, which lay partially hidden beneath the table. Catherine understood immediately. She needed to create a distraction, something that would allow Ethan to reach the weapon. Taking a deep breath, she suddenly went limp in Whitfield's grasp, as if fainting. The professor, unprepared for her dead weight, staggered backward, his grip on her arm loosening. Catherine used the momentum to twist away from him, shoving him hard in the process. Whitfield stumbled, off balance but not down. Ethan seized the opportunity, diving for the fallen revolver. He rolled, coming up with the weapon just as Whitfield recovered and reached for his own gun. Two shots rang out almost simultaneously, the reports deafening in the confined space of the cabin. Catherine watched in horror as Ethan jerked backward, a red stain blossoming on his already bloodied shirt. But Whitfield fared worse. The professor's expression was one of almost comical surprise as he looked down at the spreading crimson circle on his chest. He took one staggering step forward, then collapsed to the cabin floor. The remaining assailant, seeing his employer fall, turned and fled through the broken door, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. Catherine rushed to Ethan's side, her heart pounding with fear as she knelt beside him. "Ethan, where are you hit?" Ethan grimaced, pressing a hand to his side. "Grazed me, not deep." He struggled to sit up, his face pale with pain despite his reassurance. "The other one got away." "Let him go," Catherine said, helping Ethan to the bed. "He's a hired gun, not the mastermind. Without Whitfield, he has no reason to pursue the map." She glanced at the professor's motionless form, a mixture of relief and regret washing over her. The man had betrayed her father, caused his death, and hunted her across half the country, yet there was no satisfaction in seeing him dead. Ethan followed her gaze. "I'm sorry it came to this," he said quietly. "Taking a life, it marks a man." "You had no choice," Catherine replied, beginning to unbutton his shirt to assess his wounds. "He would have killed us both." The bullet that had struck Ethan during the final exchange had indeed only grazed his side, leaving a furrow of torn flesh that bled freely, but wasn't life-threatening. The earlier wound to his shoulder was more concerning, a through and through that had missed bone, but caused significant blood loss. Catherine worked quickly, cleaning and binding both injuries with supplies from Ethan's small medical kit. Her hands were steady, focused on the task, despite the turmoil of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "You've done this before," Ethan observed, watching her efficient movements. "I volunteered at a hospital during the war," Catherine explained, tying off a bandage around his shoulder. "My father believed in service, even for women." When she finished, exhaustion suddenly crashed over her, the aftermath of fear and adrenaline leaving her trembling. Ethan, despite his injuries, pulled her gently against his uninjured side. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "You're safe now." As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the cabin in soft golden light, Catherine allowed herself to believe it might be true. With Whitfield dead, the immediate threat had ended. The map and journal were still secure, her father's discovery protected from those who would steal it. But as the reality of the night's events settled around them, new questions arose. What happened next? The stage to Laramie would arrive in Cottonwood in 2 days. Catherine's original plan had been to continue to her uncle, to use his legal connections to register her father's claim properly. Yet now, sitting beside Ethan in the quiet aftermath of violence, that plan seemed hollow, incomplete. The thought of leaving him behind in this cabin, returning to the life her father had envisioned for her, it left an ache in her chest that had nothing to do with physical exertion. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked softly, seeming to sense the direction of her thoughts. Catherine hesitated, uncertainty making her cautious. They had known each other less than a week, had shared danger and passion in equal measure, but was it enough to build a future upon? "I'm thinking about Laramie," she admitted finally. "About what waits for me there." Ethan tensed almost imperceptibly beside her. "Your uncle, the silver claim." "Yes," Catherine drew a deep breath, "but I'm also thinking about what I'd be leaving behind." Ethan shifted to look at her, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his wounds. "Catherine, I have nothing to offer you. This cabin, some traps, a horse, it's no life for a woman like you." "A woman like me," Catherine repeated, a hint of challenge in her voice. "And what kind of woman is that exactly? Educated, refined, used to comforts and society." Ethan gestured at the rustic surroundings. "This is exile, not a home." Catherine stood, moving to the shattered window where the morning light streamed in, illuminating the devastation of the night's battle. Outside, the mountains rose majestic against the sky, wild and beautiful. "When I left Chicago," she said quietly, "I thought I was running from death, but I think perhaps I was running toward life, a different kind of life than the one mapped out for me." She turned back to face Ethan. "I've never felt more alive than I have these past few days. Despite the danger, or perhaps because of it, I've discovered parts of myself I never knew existed." Ethan watched her, his blue eyes intense. "What are you saying?" Catherine moved back to sit beside him, taking his hand in hers. "I'm saying that perhaps exile can become home with the right companion." Hope flickered in Ethan's expression, quickly tempered by caution. "You can't make that decision now, in the aftermath of what we've just survived. Danger and proximity create feelings that might not last in calmer times." "True," Catherine conceded. "Which is why I still need to go to Laramie. My uncle can help me secure my father's claim legally, and I need time we both do to be certain of what we want." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. "And afterward?" "Afterward," Catherine said, a smile curving her lips. "I thought I might return to Cottonwood. I hear there's beautiful country around here, valleys filled with wildflowers in summer." The tension in Ethan's face eased, replaced by a tentative joy that transformed his features. "I know a guide who could show you those valleys," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Man who lives in a cabin near Cottonwood Creek." "I've heard of him," Catherine replied, leaning forward to press her lips gently against his. "They say he's quite heroic, pulls drowning women from creeks without a second thought." Ethan's laugh was soft against her mouth as he returned her kiss. "Only the ones worth saving." 2 days later, they buried Whitfield on a hillside overlooking the cabin, a simple grave marked only by a wooden cross. The other man, whom Ethan had killed in the struggle, they buried nearby. Catherine said a brief prayer over both graves, not for the men they had become, but for what they might have been in better circumstances. Ethan's wounds were healing well, though he still moved with careful deliberation as they prepared to travel to Cottonwood. The stage would arrive the following day, and Catherine needed to be there to secure her passage to Laramie. As they rode double on Sadie, Catherine found herself memorizing the feel of Ethan's arms around her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way the sun gilded his profile when she turned to speak to him. 2 weeks ago, he had been a stranger. Now, she could hardly imagine a future that didn't include him. In Cottonwood, they found the small settlement buzzing with news of Professor Whitfield's disappearance. Apparently, he had made inquiries about Catherine in several towns before arriving in Cottonwood with his associates. "Nasty piece of work, if you ask me," George Henderson confided as he helped Catherine select supplies for her journey. "Had the look of a man who'd sell his mother for the right price." Catherine made no comment on Whitfield's fate, and Ethan maintained a similar silence. What had happened at the cabin would remain their secret, buried with the men on the hillside. The stage arrived on schedule the next morning, a cloud of dust announcing its approach long before the vehicle itself appeared on the horizon. Catherine stood on the boardwalk outside Henderson's store, her few possessions packed in a new carpet bag, Ethan a solid presence beside her. "Last chance to change your mind," he said quietly as the stage drew nearer. Catherine smiled up at him, her heart full despite the impending separation. "Not changing my mind, just postponing our beginning." Ethan's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with a familiarity that belied their short acquaintance. "I'll be here," he promised, "however long it takes." The stage rolled to a stop before them, the driver calling out, "Cottonwood, 10 minutes, folks." As passengers disembarked, stretching after the long, jolting journey, Catherine turned to face Ethan fully. "1 month," she said. "I'll settle my father's affairs and return in 1 month." Ethan nodded, his expression solemn but his eyes bright with promise. "I'll meet this stage in 4 weeks' time. If you're on it, we'll figure out what comes next together." "And if I'm not?" Catherine asked, testing him. A slow smile spread across Ethan's face. "Then I'll come find you, Catherine Lawson. I didn't pull you from that creek just to lose you now." The driver called for passengers to board. Catherine rose on tiptoe to press a final kiss to Ethan's lips, brief, but filled with promise. Then she turned and climbed into the stage, settling onto the hard leather seat as the vehicle prepared to depart. Through the window, she watched Ethan standing tall and straight on the boardwalk, his hat in his hand, the morning sun turning his hair to gold. As the stage lurched into motion, he raised his hand in farewell, his smile a beacon she carried with her as Cottonwood receded in the distance. The journey to Laramie took 3 days of hard travel, the stage stopping only at way stations for fresh horses and quick meals. Catherine used the time to organize her thoughts and plans, rehearsing what she would tell her uncle about her father's death and discovery. The silver map and journal remained secure in her possession, the knowledge they contained potentially valuable enough to secure her future. Yet Catherine found her thoughts dwelling not on future wealth, but on a simple cabin beside a creek, and the man who had made it feel like home. Laramie proved larger and more developed than Cottonwood, a proper town with brick buildings and boardwalks, a hotel, and several saloons. Catherine's uncle, Judge Henry Lawson, lived in a comfortable house on the town's outskirts, a widower whose only daughter had married and moved to San Francisco years earlier. His shock at seeing his brother's only child on his doorstep quickly turned to grief when Catherine related the circumstances of her father's death. The judge was a tall, imposing man with the same auburn hair as Catherine's father, though liberally streaked with gray. "I should have insisted William come west years ago," he said, pouring himself a generous measure of whiskey as they sat in his book-lined study. "Chicago was never safe enough for a man with his soft heart." "Father loved his work at the university," Catherine replied, accepting the cup of tea his housekeeper had prepared. "He wouldn't have been happy anywhere else." The judge nodded solemnly. "And now this map you speak of, you're certain it's accurate?" Catherine produced the oilskin packet, carefully unwrapping the journal and map it contained. Father was meticulous in his research. He spent 3 summers surveying these mountains before he was certain of his findings. As Judge Lawson examined the materials, his eyebrows rose in surprise. "This is no small deposit, Catherine. If these calculations are correct, there's a fortune in these hills." "Enough to have cost my father his life," Catherine said quietly. The judge looked up sharply. "And nearly yours as well, from what you've told me. These men who pursued you, you're certain they're no longer a threat." Catherine thought of the graves on the hillside near Ethan's cabin. "The leader is dead. His hired men have no reason to continue the pursuit without him." Judge Lawson studied her for a long moment, seeming to sense there was more to the story than she was telling. But he asked no further questions, instead focusing on practical matters. "We'll file a claim first thing tomorrow," he said decisively. "As William's heir, the rights will pass to you. Once it's officially registered, we can discuss how best to proceed with development." The next 2 weeks passed in a whirl of legal proceedings and business discussions. The judge introduced Catherine to mining engineers and potential investors, men who could help transform her father's discovery into a working mine. The claim was filed and recorded without incident, making Catherine the legal owner of what preliminary surveys suggested might be one of the richest silver deposits in the territory. Throughout it all, Catherine found herself increasingly distracted by thoughts of Ethan and their parting promise. As wealth and opportunity opened before her, the pull toward the solitary cabin in the wilderness only grew stronger. Her uncle noticed her preoccupation as they shared dinner 18 days after her arrival. "You seem distant tonight, my dear," he observed, setting down his fork. "Are you unwell?" Catherine smiled ruefully. "Just thinking, Uncle, There's been so much to absorb these past weeks. Indeed. The judge studied her with shrewd eyes. And yet I sense your thoughts are elsewhere, perhaps back toward Cottonwood. Heat rose in Catherine's cheeks at her uncle's perception. There is someone there, she admitted. A man who helped me when I was in danger. Ah, Judge Lawson nodded slowly. And this man, he has a name, I presume? Ethan Vance, Catherine replied, unable to keep the warmth from her voice as she spoke his name. He saved my life when my wagon overturned at a creek crossing. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. Vance, not Lieutenant Ethan Vance, formerly of the Union Army Scouts. Catherine stared at her uncle in surprise. Yes, he mentioned serving as a scout during the war. Do you know him? Not personally, the judge replied, but his reputation reached even as far as Laramie. They called him the Ghost for his ability to move through Confederate territory undetected. He paused, considering. He was highly decorated, saved an entire company by warning them of an ambush. Then disappeared after Appomattox. Some said he couldn't adjust to peacetime. Catherine absorbed this new information about the man who had come to mean so much to her. It explained the shadows she sometimes saw in his eyes, the scars that marked his body, his choice to seek solitude rather than society. He lives simply, she said. A cabin near Cottonwood Creek. He hunts, traps, sometimes guides survey teams. And you care for him, the judge stated, not a question but a certainty. Catherine met her uncle's gaze directly. Yes, more than I thought possible in so short a time. Judge Lawson leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression crossing his features. The heart keeps its own calendar, my dear. Your aunt and I knew within a week that we would spend our lives together. Hope flared in Catherine's chest at her uncle's apparent understanding. I promised to return to Cottonwood in a month's time, she said. There are only 10 days left before I'm due back. And the silver mine? The judge asked. What of your father's legacy? Catherine had been contemplating this question for days, turning possibilities over in her mind. The mine will be developed, she said with quiet certainty. But I don't need to oversee every detail personally. With the right partners and your guidance, it can proceed she hesitated. While you build a life elsewhere, her uncle suggested gently. Yes, Catherine admitted. I never wanted wealth for its own sake, Uncle Henry. What I want is a life with meaning, with purpose, with love. The judge reached across the table to pat her hand, his eyes kind. Your father would understand, Catherine. He valued love above all else. It's why he never remarried after your mother's death, though many tried to catch his eye. Catherine smiled, grateful for her uncle's support. Then you don't think I'm foolish, considering a future with a man I've known so briefly? Foolish? No. Judge Lawson shook his head. But I would be remiss as your guardian if I didn't suggest a certain prudence. The mining claim gives you options, Catherine. You needn't rush into marriage, even for love. I'm not rushing, Catherine assured him. But I do need to return to Cottonwood as promised. What happens after that? We'll decide together. 3 days later, Catherine stood on the platform of the Laramie Stagecoach Depot, her uncle beside her as they waited for the westbound stage. Her new carpetbag was packed with practical clothes suited for frontier life, along with the legal papers establishing her ownership of the silver mine. You'll write, of course, Judge Lawson said, a hint of wistfulness in his voice. After less than 3 weeks, he had grown accustomed to having his niece in his home, bringing youth and vitality to his solitary existence. Of course, Catherine promised, impulsively hugging the tall, dignified man. And you'll visit when the mine begins operations, perhaps by then. She trailed off, not wanting to presume too much about her future with Ethan. The judge smiled, understanding her unspoken thought. Perhaps by then I'll have a grand niece or nephew to spoil, he finished for her. I should like that very much. The arrival of the stage interrupted their farewell. As Catherine prepared to board, her uncle pressed a small velvet pouch into her hand. "A gift," he said. "Open it later." The journey back to Cottonwood seemed both longer and shorter than her trip to Laramie, longer in her impatience to see Ethan again, shorter in that each mile brought her closer to the future she had chosen. During a stop at a way station, Catherine opened her uncle's gift. Inside the velvet pouch, she found a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. When she pressed the tiny clasp, it opened to reveal a miniature portrait of her parents on their wedding day, her mother radiant in white, her father beaming with pride. A small note accompanied the locket. "Your mother wore this on her wedding day. May it bring you the same happiness it brought her. With love, Uncle Henry." Tears pricked Catherine's eyes as she fastened the locket around her neck. It was the perfect blessing for the journey. She was undertaking a connection to her past as she moved toward her future. The stage arrived in Cottonwood exactly 4 weeks after Catherine's departure. As the vehicle rolled to a stop before Henderson's Mercantile, her heart pounded against her ribs, eyes searching anxiously for a tall figure in a worn leather vest and Stetson hat. For a terrible moment, she didn't see him among the small crowd gathered to meet the stage. Had he changed his mind? Had something happened to him in her absence? Then the crowd parted, and there he was standing apart from the others, his blue eyes fixed on the stage with an intensity that stole Catherine's breath. Ethan looked different somehow, his hair freshly trimmed, his face clean-shaven, wearing a new shirt and vest that Catherine suspected had been purchased specifically for this occasion. When their eyes met through the stage window, his solemn expression bloomed into a smile of such radiant joy that Catherine couldn't wait for the driver to help her down. She flung the door open herself and practically flew from the stage into Ethan's waiting arms. He caught her easily despite her momentum, lifting her off her feet in an embrace that communicated everything words could not. Around them, the townspeople of Cottonwood watched with knowing smiles, but Catherine was aware of nothing but the solid warmth of Ethan's body against hers, the familiar scent of pine and leather that she had missed so desperately. "You came back," Ethan murmured against her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "I promised I would," Catherine replied, drawing back just far enough to look into his face. "Did you doubt me?" Ethan shook his head, his eyes never leaving hers. "Not you. But I thought perhaps your uncle, the silver mine, the future that could be yours, might make more sense then." He gestured vaguely at himself and their surroundings. Catherine raised a hand to his cheek, her touch gentle but sure. "The future that makes sense to me is the one with you in it, Ethan Vance. The rest we can figure out as we go." The doubt in Ethan's eyes faded, replaced by a certainty that matched her own. Without regard for the onlookers, he lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss filled with promise and homecoming both. When they finally separated, George Henderson was standing nearby with Catherine's carpetbag, a broad grin splitting his bearded face. "Told Mrs. Wilkins to ready her back parlor," he said, handing the bag to Ethan. "Figured you two might want to talk private-like before heading back to your place, Ethan." "Thank you, George," Catherine said, her cheeks warm but her smile unwavering. The proprieties of Eastern society seemed far away and unimportant here, where life was measured by sterner realities than social convention. In Mrs. Wilkins's parlor, with tea and cookies provided by their beaming hostess, who discreetly closed the door behind her, Catherine and Ethan finally had the chance to talk uninterrupted. "Tell me everything," Ethan said, taking her hands in his. "Did your uncle help with the claim?" Catherine nodded, explaining the legal proceedings, the confirmation of the silver deposit's value, and the plans for its development. Uncle Henry will oversee most of it, she concluded. I'll need to return occasionally, but not for extended periods. Return from where? Ethan asked, the question careful, measured. Catherine met his gaze steadily. From our home, wherever that may be. A myriad of emotions crossed Ethan's face: hope, joy, disbelief, caution. Catherine, what exactly are you saying? I'm saying, Catherine replied, squeezing his hands, that I love you, Ethan Vance. That I want to build a life with you. That wealth means nothing without happiness, and I've never been happier than in that cabin by the creek with you. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing a blow. When he opened them, they shone with unshed tears. I've loved you since you stood dripping and defiant on that creek bank, he said hoarsely. But I never dared hope you'd choose this life, choose me over everything else available to you. It's not a choice between you and everything else, Catherine corrected gently. It's choosing what matters most. You matter most, Ethan. He released her hands only to reach inside his vest pocket, producing a small object that caught the light from the window. I've been carrying this for 2 weeks, he said, opening his palm to reveal a simple gold ring with a small pearl set in its center. It was my mother's. I rode to Cheyenne to retrieve it from the bank where I've kept it all these years. Catherine's breath caught as Ethan slid from his chair to one knee before her, the ring held between his thumb and forefinger. Catherine Lawson, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? I can't offer you a mansion or fine clothes or the society you were raised in, but I swear I'll spend every day trying to make you happy. Tears spilled down Catherine's cheeks as she extended her left hand. Yes, she whispered, her voice failing her for a moment before she found it again. Yes, Ethan. 1,000 times yes. The ring slid onto her finger as if made for her, the pearl glowing softly in the afternoon light. As Ethan rose to kiss her, Catherine felt the rightness of their union settle into her bones, a certainty deeper than reason or convention could explain. They were married 2 days later in Cottonwood's small church, with George Henderson giving the bride away and Mrs. Wilkins serving as witness. Catherine wore a simple blue dress purchased from the mercantile, her mother's locket around her neck and wildflowers in her hair. Ethan, in a new suit that sat somewhat stiffly on his shoulders, looked at her as if she were the sunrise after the longest night. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, the elderly circuit preacher beaming at the couple as he pronounced them man and wife. When Ethan kissed her before the altar, Catherine heard Mrs. Wilkins sniff emotionally from the front pew. After a celebration dinner at the town's only restaurant, they rode back to Ethan's cabin, their cabin now as husband and wife. The structure stood as they had left it, though Ethan had repaired the window and door damaged in the confrontation with Whitfield and his men. Inside, Catherine found new touches that spoke of Ethan's preparations for her return: curtains on the repaired window, a rocking chair beside the fireplace, a larger bed to replace the narrow one she remembered. I wasn't sure you'd come back, Ethan admitted as they stood in the center of the cabin, but I wanted to be ready if you did. Catherine turned in a slow circle, taking in the humble space that would be their home, at least for now. It's perfect, she said softly. Everything I could want. Later, as they lay together in the new bed, the moonlight silvering the cabin through the window, Ethan traced the curve of Catherine's cheek with gentle fingers. I keep thinking I'll wake and find this was all a dream, he murmured. That you'll be gone, back to the life you were meant for. Catherine caught his hand, pressing a kiss to his palm. I am living the life I was meant for, Ethan. Right here with you. The certainty in her voice seemed to finally convince him, the last of his doubts fading as he gathered her closer. Then I am the most fortunate man in the territory, Mrs. Vance. The name, so new and yet so right, brought a smile to Catherine's lips as she nestled against her husband's chest. "And I the most fortunate woman, Mr. Vance." In the years that followed, their life together evolved in ways neither could have predicted that day by Cottonwood Creek. The silver mine prospered under Judge Lawson's guidance, providing Catherine with a modest fortune that she and Ethan used wisely. They built a larger home not far from the original cabin, which Ethan kept as his workshop and occasional retreat when the need for solitude struck him. Catherine established a small school for the children of miners and settlers, fulfilling a dream of teaching she had harbored since childhood. Ethan continued his hunting and trapping, but also found a new purpose as a deputy to the territorial marshal, his tracking skills and calm courage making him invaluable in maintaining peace in the growing community. Their family grew with the birth of two children, William Henry, named for Catherine's father and uncle, and Sarah Elizabeth, named for Ethan's mother. The children thrived in the mountain air, as wild and free as the land itself, yet tempered by their mother's insistence on education and their father's quiet moral guidance. On the 10th anniversary of the day Catherine fell from her wagon into Cottonwood Creek, she and Ethan returned to that spot alone, leaving their children with Mrs. Wilkins for the afternoon. The creek ran clear and cold as ever, though lower than on that fateful spring day a decade earlier. Standing on the bank, Catherine slipped her hand into Ethan's, their fingers intertwining with the comfortable familiarity of long marriage. "You ever wonder," she asked, "what would have happened if my wagon wheel hadn't struck that boulder? If I had made it safely to Laramie without meeting you?" Ethan considered the question, his blue eyes still as striking as the day they first met, though now crinkled at the corners from smiling at their children gazing out over the water. "I think," he said finally, "that what's meant to be finds a way, if not here then somewhere else along the trail." Catherine leaned her head against his shoulder, contentment warming her despite the cool breeze off the water. "I'm glad it was here," she said. "I'm glad it was you who said I wouldn't drown on your watch." Ethan's arm encircled her waist, pulling her close against his side. "Best decision I ever made, jumping into that creek after a stubborn woman from Chicago." Catherine laughed, the sound echoing across the water. "And the best fall I ever took," she replied, "was the one that led me to you." As they turned to walk back to their horses and the life they had built together, Catherine offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the accident that had seemed like disaster but proved to be destiny. The wagon wheel was long gone, swept away by the creek's current, but the journey it had interrupted had led to a destination far more precious than any she could have imagined. In saving her from drowning, Ethan Vance had given Catherine not just life, but a life worth living, one filled with love, purpose, and the quiet joy of belonging completely to another soul. The silver in the mountains had made them wealthy by frontier standards, but it was the richness of their shared days that constituted their true fortune. And as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the land in gold and amber, Catherine knew with absolute certainty that she would choose this same path again: the fall, the creek, the cowboy, and all that came after 1,000 times over.